Your brain, your body, your mind, your soul. The What's Working Show with Kelly and Kyle.
If you haven't seen part 1 of our interview with Flor Edwards, make sure you go back and watch that, because today we are joined by MedCircle doctor, Dr. Ramani, who's going to weigh in on Flor's story out of an apocalyptic cult and into one of self-discovery and healing. Dr. Ramani, thanks for coming on Callie's show.
This is, well, you know what? Callie was the draw this time, Kyle. I was always waiting for the invitation, and
But now,
finally come.
she woke up as soon as you came on here, so she must be excited. Dr. Ramani, you've been just over on the corner listening to us. Mm-hmm. What are your initial thoughts?
You know, it's amazing to hear Flor's story, not just for the individual and gripping nature. I've had the opportunity to start reading her book, and amazing, so beautifully written that I'm very snobby about writing, and I'm like, oh my God, she's not a writer, like she's an artist. It's amazing. So the book is stunning. But what struck me also about Flor's story, watching it, reading it, listening to it, is how universal it is. It's a story about vulnerability. It's a story about our narratives. It's how we get shaped, but it's also a lesson on human nature. And some of the darker corners I've talked about on other MedCircle shows, which is, you know, what happens when people of, you know, less than optimal motivation come into the purview of the rest of us, and sort of how we as people have to learn to sort of protect ourselves, and almost that sense of self-awareness and self-preservation is so important. So this is absolutely an extreme version of it, but I think I was struck by not only her personal story, but the universality of the story. Yeah.
I mean, you see a lot of people in your practice, and you've taught a lot of students who are interested in clinical psychology. And you bring up this concept of a universal story, but what is that universal story? Because I'll tell you what I think it is, but I want to hear what you think it is.
You know, I think that as nuanced and complex we human beings are, we've got some pretty universal things that matter to us. Flor spent some time, I heard, talking about healing. You know, that this idea that for many of us, not all of us, but for many of us, we are motivated by growth. I think we're all motivated by different things. And, you know, some people are more motivated by power, but many people are motivated by closeness. But at the end of the day, you know, like I said, everyone's going to be born and everyone's going to die. There's universalities there, but relationships matter. Stories matter. And I think that there are no absolutely hopeless stories. I think that's what's absolutely critical, is that there are 1,000 places we can insert ourselves into a person's story and change the arc of that tale. So I think a lot of times people say, I give up, there's no more hope. And, you know, I think that the more stories you hear, the more you realize, oh, yeah, there's actually more places to enter this tale than you can imagine. But I do think all of us at different paces are by and large trying to grow, trying to figure this all out. And I think people have been trying to figure stuff out ever since we were people.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, we've literally dedicated entire shows and companies to that very
That's right.
thing. So what I loved about our conversation, among many things, is the fact that you got really still with yourself. You asked yourself those big questions, and you had that internal dialogue, and then it really came out when you started to prepare and write your book. For people who maybe aren't a writer or don't know how to have that internal dialogue, what do you think, and this will be for both of you, do you think would be a way people can start to get those answers to life's toughest questions?
The best way to get the answers to life's questions is to ask them in the first place. And I think a lot of us, too many of us, are so blindly walking through life.
We so are.
Your story is extraordinary for how beyond all of our sort of seemingly garden variety experiences are. But everyone has a story. And that's what therapy is, right? Therapy is sitting in a room with ideally a therapist who genuinely cares and is invested in your story and hears it, but also reminds you there's many different ways to tell a story. I've always said this, and I think I've even said this on MedCircle. Every story can be a miracle or a tragedy. It really just depends how you tell it.
Yes.
That is just so good. That is so good. Because the question I just asked myself is, Kyle, what story am I telling myself?
Yeah.
What is my story? And is it true or not? Is
That's
it a
right.
nightmare or is it a dream? Like what am I telling myself? And you actually shared that in our Med Circle series. That dialogue we tell ourselves over and over and over again starts to become the reality.
Who we are, yeah. And I think, kind of to answer your question, I think self-awareness is very important. I think we can get really, I keep talking about this, distracted. I think social media can be extremely helpful, but it can be extremely destructive. And I think it's becoming a platform where people just go and sort of, people are telling stories on social media, but how productive are they being? And I think it's easy to, again, project, you know, and so people are commenting and they see something and oh that's not me, I would never be like that, and they make a comment and they're, you know, oh, I'm so good, I'm a good person. But self-awareness is not selfishness. It's, you know, becoming aware of something is the first step to healing, actually. You know, when you start to heal, you have this moment where you're like, oh my God, this is disgusting, right? Like the addict or you know, someone who has a health crisis. When you become aware of it, it's disarming in a way, but that's the beginning of healing.
One of my first questions for you was, have you been to therapy? And you told me that you tried it once, not really your deal. Understandable. Now we actually have a therapist here. What questions would you have, or would you mind sharing your hesitation of doing therapy with Dr. Ramani?
Well, for me, I've tried it a few times, and when I say I haven't done therapy, I mean I haven't done traditional talk therapy.
Yes,
which
good
is
point.
different.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of therapy. For me, going to the ocean is therapy, and listening to the waves crashing on the shore is therapy. But I think traditional talk therapy. I'm not a psychologist at all. I don't even know that much about psychology. But I always say I could sit with a room of psychologists and probably hold my own, because I've had such an intense psychological experience. But when it comes to traditional talk therapy, it's about telling stories. And somehow I took it upon myself to tell this story. So I found a way to articulate and communicate it. And I think a part of healing is to have that outlet, that expression. Like, again, we live in this world where a lot of us don't even get that chance to, we're human, we want to express ourselves in some way, whether it's musically, whether it's through the body, whether it's artistically, whether it's creatively. For me, it just happens to be through stories and through language. And so I guess once I found that, it's been hard for me to actually sit with a person and say, now I'm gonna kind of trust you to take my story. And in some ways, I initiated my own therapy through writing. So I think that's why talk therapy was never something that I've been successful at doing. I have tried it a couple times, I think 3 times actually. And each time I sat one time and I was just like, this is not going to work for me at all. The last time I did it, I just had an awful experience and I was like, no way.
That's not an unusual response for people who try therapy.
I have tried it.
Yeah. Dr. Ramani, do you want to comment on that?
You know, I think it's really important that people hear that sometimes you walk into a therapy room and it doesn't feel right? And I have to be honest with you, not only does it not sometimes feel right for the client, it doesn't feel right for the therapist, right? I'm not connecting here. And anytime we've had that happen, the most graceful experience is when both client and therapist kind of agree. It's like almost like a dating thing. Right? I'm not, you know, and without really saying I'm not feeling this, but the person saying, oh, do you have any ideas of referrals? And the therapist saying, you know, I do. And so it means, though, that the therapist can't view this as a diss, because for a healthy therapist, you want what's the best place for your given client. But I agree that I think people have mixed experiences. I think people find that they enter therapy at certain times of life and it works beautifully. They enter it at others and it's not a fit, you know, and it's not meant to be a one-off. It's not like surgery. Right? It's a place that people may come in and out at different parts of their lives, and that's okay. I think one of the most interesting things in doing therapy, there have been clients who've been in and out of my practice for 8 years. I'll see them for 6 months, they'll stop for 2 years, they'll come back, and I think that's a really interesting growth resource for them. It's as though a lot of the skills we learn, they kind of are putting to use, and then they go and practice those skills, and then it's almost like a booster or a calibration. But as you said, there are so many forms of expression, and in therapy, it's a talking expression. For some people, that writing expression, when we look at research by James Pennebaker, who talks about the emotional impact of journaling, it was having the kinds of effects we'd see of therapy, of writing, of journaling.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's a very powerful intervention, whether it be writing, whether it be painting, whether it be whatever works for a person. But then I'd say it's not just about doing the activity. It's doing that activity, writing or painting or running, and connecting it back to your experience of growth. You can't just do it and say, I just had therapy. You have to say, what just happened out there? And it might be that your thoughts were flowing, you weren't judging your thoughts, you were putting your thoughts out there, that there's some sort of reflective moment. The therapist acts as almost a guide to that reflection when you're having that experience.
Yeah, it's almost like writing your book was a guided therapy session because you had to go back and talk to people and learn why they did this and go back to your desire to understand. And I think you would have been a writer if you weren't born into your family and this experience, because it's so innate within you.
That's exactly what my agent said.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. Again,
We don't always trust agents all the time.
I have the best agent in the business, I swear.
Except
She's
for
amazing.
Yeah.
But yeah, she said the exact same thing. She said, even if you didn't have the story, I think you would, I know you would be a writer.
So the fact that you can take this innate gift and then use it as a tool to reflect, that is what's working and what's worked so well for you.
Thank you.
I believe, and it sounds like Dr. Ramani just would agree with that too.
Yeah, and I want to echo what she said about self-reflection. I mean, when I do teach writing, it's very important. It's kind of like a full circle, but at the end you have to reflect on what you learned. It's not just about doing the act of something. It's about understanding what you're doing, what intention you have. Some people might make a painting just to hang it in their room, and I think also when you do create some sort of art, whatever it may be, it's about that connection we were talking about, whether it's to another person or to that divine, or to yourself, or to a sense of community. Community is extremely important for healing. That's, again, something that we've almost completely lost.
Yes. Well, Dr. Ramani has given me, myself, plenty to work on. And in fact, my 2019 goal came from this snippet and advice from Dr. Ramani. So take a look at this.
In order to love people, we sometimes have to do things that don't always feel comfortable for us, because that's love. To really be there for people and hear them and give richness and validation to their stories by hearing them with an open heart.
That's so good. I can do that though. I literally can practice this with people. Because right now you're so right. I avoid it at all costs because I'm like, oh, this isn't important, this isn't important, this isn't important. So I'm not practicing it. So how would I be able to do it when it matters?
Exactly.
Not that it doesn't matter now, but when it matters in my relationship.
I mean, it could be like a friend kind of yammering on about some bad date
and I could put my phone away and just go, you need to unload and I will listen.
And don't be, you don't need to be like, all like, chirpy and all that. Like really just, lie back in the sofa and hear it. Put that phone away, be present with it. Don't let other people's emotions be a place of fear for you. Because they're not asking you to take them. It's not like they're trying to unload cargo on you. They're just they want the simple act of another human being listening to them, because that's really where a relationship happens. Listen, more days than not, the only thing a partner and two partners might talk about is who's taking the car this morning and did you remember to get the milk? Not every day is a big ticket day in a relationship. But when those big ticket days happen, those are the bridges that carry the relationship to the next level. And that's where narcissistic people can't go. So while I'm not saying those patterns for you, I do think practice it, because being there for another person emotionally is a practice skill. And in our technologically soaked world, people are not good at being there for other people. They're so distracted. They're like fondling their phones. Put it away. Look at that person. Be present with them. Stop doing your grocery list in your mind and be in the room.
So in 2019, I'm working on being more empathetic. And in your book, Flor, I noticed that when your parents joined this cult, they gave birth to you while they were in this cult. And even when your whole family left with your parents, the cult, it didn't come off in the book that you had a lot of anger or hatred. You seemed very forgiving, and you seemed empathic to your parents and almost understanding why they did what they did. Is that true?
I mean, yeah, it doesn't mean I didn't experience anger.
Of course.
I definitely had moments of not so much anger, but confusion. And I think that confusion was expressed as anger. I had this weird, I don't know if it's weird, but this theory that if you sit with something long enough, eventually it's going to transform into something different.
What do you mean sit with something?
Like anger or fear or whatever quote unquote negative. There's no negative emotion.
If you're aware of it.
We have all kinds of emotions, and they're not good or bad. They're reactions to, they're physical reactions to something. So if you're experiencing something like anger or fear, if you sit with it long enough, it transforms into something different. And for me, my anger or in a way, it was also sadness. You know, I was grieving this loss of my childhood, but I sat with it long enough to transform it into something different.
Did you feel empathy towards your parents?
I did, especially after I understood. And, you know, I know my parents very well. And it's always been hard for me to be angry at them. You know, I've talked to other kids too. I recently met someone, actually they're in this area, but they're working on stuff about the children of God as well. And we all agree that it's really hard to be angry at our parents when they joined this thing. It was a movement. It was an energy that swept through California initially, and these people they got swept up in it for their own reasons. You know, we can't understand everyone's process and everyone's reasons for doing things, you know?
Yeah, I understand that. Dr. Ramani, how does empathy play a role in healing?
Oh, empathy is huge in healing. I think a lot of people confuse empathy and forgiveness.
Yeah, amen to that. Yeah.
They're related, but they're definitely not identical processes, okay? Yeah. So empathy reflects an ability to, at least an attempt to understand the feelings or experiences of another person, as well as to reflect on the impact of your behavior, your words on another person. Okay, so it's both parts of that. And in that empathy, it doesn't mean you agree with that person, but it's an attempt to understand the why and to meet them where they're at, which might be if you're being empathic and your friend is going through a difficult time, they just got fired. You would hold back on sharing the news about your promotion or your raise or something like that. That's empathy, okay? Now, in your story, Flor, in this idea of having empathy, and as you were asking Flor about, do you have empathy for your parents? I could absolutely see how there could be empathy for parents. I understand how they got pulled into this. I understand why this mattered so much to them, and et cetera, et cetera. But where the struggle point becomes is that empathy may not translate into, and I forgive them. I don't forgive them. I'm not saying that's your case, but I've worked with many clients who say, finally, I get it. I get what they're about. I'm still really angry and I'm not ready to forgive, to which I say, there's no requirement on this one. If you never forgive, you're okay. You may just simply get as far as letting it go, understanding and taking that empathy and paying it forward into the other relationships in your life.
Yes.
And so I think that the confusion of those two processes sometimes throws people off, but that capacity to attempt to understand yourself and the other is key to all healing, because it's how we can bridge divides. It's how we can bridge polarization. It's honestly the only tool we've got left in a world that often seems to be falling apart at the seams. It's the way I could reach out to somebody whose political views are absolutely different than mine, but I may be able to understand when they tell me their story. I can understand where this comes from. I don't agree with it, but there's no reason we cannot reach out and attempt to understand each other's experiences, because we do both share one thing, is we both have a story that shapes our lives. Yes. That's it, but we're in a world that doesn't have enough of it, and it is so key to healing, because once they get empathy, a person's like, now I get it, and I can put some of this burden down, and I can move forward into their healing journey.
Yes. I want all of our viewers watching this, I'm not saying you got to make it your 2019 goal to be more empathetic. I'm doing that, but just be aware of those little moments in life where you can practice a little more empathy. And actually, Dr. Ramani, you'd be really proud of me. I had a friend call me with a problem, and you know me, I'm like, what is your problem? Like, get to it, let's fix it. He preemptively called me and said, or texted me before the call and said, by the way, I'm not trying to solve this problem. I just need you to listen. And I go, all right,
and
I'm gonna listen like I've never listened before. And I was empathetic, and I thought I did really good, and I think I did. But I would have never tackled that phone call unless I had had those conversations with you.
That's good to
because
know.
it's something we know, but we don't really know it until someone shows us, I think.
But then that becomes a process of your friend's healing, and honestly, your own personal healing. Because again, like you said, Flor made that excellent point. Healing is an ongoing process for all of us. We all have something, some wound that we are always trying to address, that we have that vulnerability that the world can often antagonize and we protect. And so empathy becomes the place that we, where we can protect that simplest thing in the world. You're walking into a business, a store, work, and somebody's not spot on with you. The first thing you should say is, I don't know what bad news they got today.
Yep.
That's it. They may have gotten the news that their mom is sick or their best friend, something's gone wrong in their life, and you greet them in that place. And I would say 50% of the time, you can turn things around just through small kindnesses with strangers.
Yeah.
Everything else is even bigger bricks on that, on the healing structure, as it were.
When we talk about healing, I think it's responsible to also talk about fear. Because a lot of the things that we're healing from were based in fear, that abuse we suffered, that obstacle we are trying to overcome. And you write on page 76, I realize now that terror was home to me. It was all I knew. There was magic in the mystery of the unknown, talking about moving all these different places. Pretty soon I wouldn't know how to function without the drama of trepidation. Fear had become my closest friend, my ally. Fear would become a tool I would learn to wield in order to operate in the world, even much later in life. Here we are. We're later in life, later than when you even wrote that. Are you still viewing and using fear that way?
I think of fear and love as the two opposite parts of a spectrum. And fear is contraction, love is expansion. And I think you can put all the other emotions on those two. And yes, I do understand. I understand fear on a level I think most people don't, because I grew up in captivity. I was completely not allowed to. I mean, aside from just the physical, control, the not being able to make my own decisions, not being able to think about my future, not be able to just do the basic day-to-day things that most people, do. And it taught me a lot, I was a very scared child. And it was because of the circumstance I grew up in. And I think as I began to know myself better, which again is a big part of it, that's not in a selfish sort of self-absorbed way, but I had to kind of come to terms with who I was. I learned what that fear was and how I could overcome it and combat it.
What do you think about that, Dr. Ramani?
Listen, fear is at the core of so much of what we think about as a origin of mental health and mental illness issues. It's where it's sort of where everything comes together in one place. How we interpret stimuli in our environment. Are we afraid of them or not? One person's roller coaster is another person's panic attack. So it's so much of fear is interpretation. There's a real fear network in the brain that gets activated under those conditions of fear.
The amygdala?
The amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. Those three brain regions work together to really sort of fix fear in place, and then we behave from that place, and then we view the world as probably full of more threats than it really is. In its most extreme case, that's what we see in post-traumatic stress disorder. You see what I'm saying? That's a terror started that, and then that terror never quite got let go of, as it were. So I think that
the healing never happened.
The healing of that, and then sort of the reinterpretation of that, and to your point about perspective, letting people know that they have more mental control over that than they originally thought. But it really is almost like a deprogramming, as it were. So I think fear is an incredibly important issue in all of mental health. And obviously the thing that goes along with fear is anxiety. Anxiety is that fear is often about something real. There's a real threat that a person is afraid of and should be. It could be anything from a marauding neighbor to a person who's going to victimize you in a crime to people keeping you in captivity. Those are things to be afraid of. They're real. Anxiety is that fear response to something that doesn't exist. It's an anticipation. Something bad's going to happen. Well, what if this happens? That's anxiety, future-oriented and not real. So anxiety would be, I think I'm in captivity. I'm like, well, actually, no, the door is open. You're just fine. You just walk right out. Versus actually being in it. Fear, anxiety.
Well, the two of you are so inspiring, and I'm so honored to have chatted with you today. And thank you so much for sharing your story. It's so brave, but also coming on here and going that extra step and sharing what's working for you today after 13 years with the children of God. You can get Apocalypse Child using the link below in the description of this video. I'm Kyle Kittleson. This is Callie the Lab. Remember, whatever you're going through, you got this.